Good afternoon. My name is John McDonough. I'm a first-year MBA student at the Booth School of Business and a co-chair of the Government and Policy Club. We're very excited to be partnering with the Institute of Politics to host today's speaker series event. Before I introduce our guest, I just want to say a few words about the format of today's event. In about 20 minutes, we will open up to take questions from the audience. If you're joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You can start submitting questions now if you would like. If your question is selected, a staff member will privately message you with next steps. Attendees will be muted and cameras off unless you ask a question, so no worries if you need to step away. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Gene Sperling. Mr. Sperling is a leading voice on economic policy and a distinguished public servant. He is the only person to serve as the director of the National Economic Council twice, first in the Clinton administration and then again under President Obama. During his tenure as NEC director in the Obama administration, Mr. Sperling was a key architect of the policy response to stabilize the economy following the global financial crisis. He helped design critical stimulus programs, including tax credits to provide relief for low-income Americans, as well as the Small Business Jobs Act. His experience and perspective is usually relevant today as governments around the world again grapple with soaring unemployment, financial distress, and difficult policy choices, this time in response to COVID-19. Recently, Mr. Sperling released his new book, Economic Dignity, which reflects on the dangers of rising inequality and financial insecurity and makes the case for a more foundational definition of what constitutes successful economic policy. Although it was written prior to the coronavirus outbreak, it offers a compelling framework for thinking about how to design policy solutions that help struggling Americans and will surely be an important guide in the years ahead. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Gene Sperling.
John, thank you so much. Thanks, Emily. Thank you, everyone who has, and David and Jake, who have all made this possible. Yes, terrible author. This is the book, Economic Dignity. But someone like me doesn't write a book, just to sell them. You wanna get your ideas out, and so this is, doing something like this is absolutely the core for me of why I would even write something like this. So let me say a little bit about that, and then we'll take it into today. And then I'm open to questions on anything from themes of the book to what's happening right now to the future policy. I've been very blessed to have had 12 years in the West Wing, to work for other people like Mario Cuomo and inspiring people. But I really did feel that there's something about the economic policy dialogue that kind of makes a lot of us take our eye off the ball. There's a huge focus on metrics, GDP, even more important, more telling metrics like median wage, but they're still on the metric, and there's fights about specific policies and past decisions and particular strategies. Every single one of those things is important. But I want to say they're not the end goal. The end goal is not a particular GDP number. Anything that you talk about is a means to an end. And what is that end? We don't talk about it enough. What is that end in terms of lifting up people's lives? So the quote that's attributed to John F. Kennedy, "A rising tide lifts all boats," that's just wrong. We know a rising tide does not always lift all boats, but it is in a sense the test. Does growth, or does a particular strategy, does it ultimately have that end goal impact of making us, of increasing the fulfillment, the happiness, the sense of well-being for the public as a whole? And so, when I was in policy, I would sometimes say to myself, okay, boy, we got a million different things we could make our priority or put in the State of the Union. I would sometimes try to step back and say, okay, what on somebody's deathbed would they say was most important? Like, what would matter most to their lives? And it's an interesting question because it gives you insight, but it doesn't always fit into a stock market valuation or a GDP number. But for me personally, it was a way of kind of thinking about when you have that precious time in the White House, when you have that precious moment to make a difference, what's most important? And I and I remember that between the Obama and Clinton administrations, I would think a lot about that. And I remember thinking to myself about the parents out in our country who struggle so heroically when they have a very ill child, or they have a family member with disability, or they're just trying to make sure a child with autism really has a chance to strive and reach their potential. And I would think to myself, that is one of the worst things in our country, that we don't ensure that a parent doesn't have to go through the pain of doing everything, working hard, and not being able to provide basic security when the children they love more than anything in life need help the most. And I remember thinking to myself that, when we go back, I hope that we try again for universal health care. I hope we try to do something about families with pre-existing conditions. And there's this moment where I'm actually, my first 2 years there, I was at Treasury. And there's this moment where a member of Congress calls, and he says, I've been talking with a bunch of other members of Congress, and we decided we'd call you because maybe you could talk to President Obama. Maybe you could convince him he shouldn't be focusing on healthcare. He should be focusing on the economy. And that was just a striking moment for me. Somehow, even here's these members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress, and they're thinking the economy is something separate from what might be most important to the well-being of individual people. And I just thought to myself, when I leave, I want to step back and write something about what our actual North Star should be for economic policy. What should be our end goal? Not just criticize GDP and particular metrics, but say what that end goal should be. And I really thought about this for years. And I didn't really start to write about dignity per se, but I started to feel that when you ask, what is it in a capitalist economy where you will have some people having bigger houses and bigger paychecks? What is it that we should say that we should guarantee to everybody in our society economy who's in some way doing their part? And I felt that when you thought about that more deeply, there was this concept of economic dignity. But I also felt that when people talk about it, they throw it out like, it's important for this, but it's also important for your dignity. And I knew that to make something a true North Star, one had to really give it a definition and define it. And I hadn't seen someone do this with the concept of economic dignity. And so I realized that for it to be a complete North Star, it really had to cover three basic pillars. Number one, does a person have the capacity not only to care for their family, but to be there for their family, not just put food on the table, but to be at the table, be at the bedtime story, be at the bedside of the last days of an older loved one. And what hit me was that, as one goes on in life, one kind of realizes that for all the achievements you might have, nothing quite, there isn't a God-given equality, that the greatest or most significant moments in life are often about moments of care for loved ones, not family in a traditional sense necessarily, but whoever you consider to be your most, the most precious loved ones in life. And that, why should we think of economic policy as not protecting that at least those things that are most equally human about all of us can be had? And yet, that economic deprivation repeatedly denies people the ability not just to have the nice vacation, but to actually have time to bond with a child, to care for a loved one, to be there for the seasons of life. So that was my first pillar, caring for family and being able to be there for the most precious moments. I think a lot of times progressives, we just stop at like, here's the list of goods. We don't go to that more quality of life. We also sometimes don't really appreciate what I feel is the second pillar, which is also intrinsic to all of us, which is the desire to pursue our potential and purpose and sense of meaning. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that we really have an ideal in this country. We've never lived up to it, clearly, with slavery and how we've treated Native Americans and women. But that ideal that the accident of your birth should not determine the outcome of your life, and that we're a nation of second chances. And even though that's an unrealized ideal, it's a beautiful ideal. And it's one that I would, rather than disparage because we haven't lived up to it, I want to hold it up. We were the first nation to get rid of debt prisons. We were the first nation to allow a fresh start after bankruptcy. There's something about that that goes to the internal dignity of people always being able to pursue a path in life. And we often think about perhaps the young minority male who has been victimized by discrimination and poverty as somehow very different, and of course is very different circumstances than maybe a laid off factory worker who never can recover. But you can see a basic humanity in the desire to always want to have a first or second chance to pursue your potential and purpose. And so I wanted that to be a second kind of universal pillar. The third pillar, which is critical, is that you have to be able to contribute in the economy with respect and not domination and humiliation. And that third pillar is not optional. The entire foundation of economic dignity falls down without that. Why? Because what we've seen when we look at some of the greatest violations of dignity, they are people, and not just the mine workers in southern West Virginia in the early part of the century. We see it today, every day, right now, with warehouse workers at Amazon, with the poultry workers. We see it over and over again. People who are so much want to care for their family. They so much want to meet that first pillar that they are forced to work with abuse, with discrimination, with harassment. And so you realize that without that worker power, that protection, economic dignity doesn't hold off. You have to have all three of these pillars. I also felt that it was important because I was struck by the degree that the focus on economic metrics creates a degree of invisibility in our economy. People become invisible. You know, when you talk to Ai-jen Poo or you talk to Mary Kay Henry and other people, you know, I think they rightly feel a little bit like, well, it's great that everybody is focused on worker insecurity because gig workers, you know, it's a huge national crisis, but there's a sense that just happened. Well, when Uber X started on 2012, it's not like cab drivers had health care and were qualified for unemployment insurance. There were 2 million domestic workers at that time, of which 12% had health care and 7% had retirement security. And I think that many of that pain becomes invisible because we're just asking, what's the job? What's the GDP? And looking deeper, forcing yourself to ask, do we have universal economic dignity? I think gives you a better focus. It reminds you why you're here, what your ultimate goal is. Now, I think that this became very relevant and even more relevant in this crisis, even though I wrote it before. And the one thing I did include in the book, which I'm so happy I did, was Martin Luther King at the sanitation workers' strike in 1968. Because it's at that moment he says his famous line that all work has dignity. But what he says before that is he says that someday our nation will realize that the sanitation worker is as essential as the physician to our health and well-being. That's always been true, but I don't know that we have really felt it with the passion of the moment. Now we see it. We feel that dissonance. How is it okay that the home healthcare worker who is risking their lives for our family, the farm worker who's providing the food, is it okay that that farm worker has no legal protections, that 50% of them don't have healthcare, or that healthcare worker, that half of them couldn't take a day off of paid leave for their paid sick leave? And you know, the last thing I'll say before I stop is that one of the things King addressed, and he always addressed it, and so did Bayard Rustin as they talked about dignity and economics, was that it's important to recognize that sense of dignity. But if you don't actually provide people with the resources to live with economic dignity, it becomes empty. So King says in that same speech, what good is it to win the right to sit at an integrated lunch counter if you don't have the money to buy your family a meal? And right now we applaud our essential workers. We call them heroes. But if they can't have a living wage, if they don't have health care, if they don't have paid sick leave, if they don't have the right to stand up without being retaliated, then I think that will become empty over time. And I criticize some of the conservatives in the book. I criticize some of the conservatives who talk the talk on dignity, but then vote against the minimum wage, vote against health care. So to really honor economic dignity, you need that recognition of all of our intrinsic value and worth and contribution, but it's a compact, and it only happens. You only have an economy that promotes economic dignity when you actually have put in place the policies that allow people to do this. And I think the moment for us is not just whether we pass, which is critical, more of the essential worker Bill of Rights type of thing that I do believe is in Speaker Pelosi's bill, but whether the next president and all of you say, this is the moment to demand an economic dignity compact, a new deal for economic workers, for all workers, a new deal, that we don't have to accept that some of us contribute, do everything we can, and have to raise our families without the degree of economic security and dignity and value that should be universal for all of us. So with that, I will stop, and I'm so happy to take any questions. So, okay. In our new technology world, I have gotten the message that the first question is from Brianna Payton, a U Chicago student graduating this year. She will not be on video, but her question is, can you please talk about the disparities between the way aid has been dispensed during COVID, quickly fewer strings attached, compared to typical government aid, SNAP, TANF, unemployment? Well, what I will say is that I think the most important thing that we see for economic dignity is that you have to be bold, but it's not actually just about, our goal shouldn't be just that we don't know how to help the people who are hurting the most, so we just spread money out to everybody without regard to their need and how essential that aid is for economic dignity. So I support the $1,200 paycheck that went out, and I think it reached a lot of people that fell through the cracks, and that's important. But the kind of help that is most needed in a crisis like this is to make people whole enough so that they can pay their bills and that they can keep their family afloat and they don't suffer the devastating harm of losing their health care or their home. And we are the worst country in the industrialized world about what happens when you just lose a job anytime. People suffer more because of the weakness of our safety net. So for me, the most important things is that we have to be better able to give big, bold relief to those who need it. And I think you're going to see that there's about 30% of our country that is out of work. And, if you have to send a check to everybody to make sure that people get a little help, I'm all for that. But the thing that will help the most is, for example, the bold unemployment insurance that right now today, very few people know, if they're not at some place like the Institute of Politics, that most people don't get covered by unemployment insurance because they're a gig worker or they're a domestic worker working for several employees. And that secondly, when you get a check, it covers 35 to 55% of your paycheck. Now we are making one step forward. We're talking about covering all workers, including gig workers and part-time workers. And we're talking about trying to fully cover their paycheck so that they can have that economic dignity, they can keep the lights on and support their family, or we try to go through their companies and make sure that money goes to a small business, as was the goal with PPP, but only if it was helping workers stay at the job. So I think this bold kind of measures that is both bold, but it is targeted to those who need it most, is really what one needs for an economic dignity agenda. But I think we have to believe in government more, and we have to be able to create mechanisms of trust so the money gets to who needs it, and that you don't have the type of unjust enrichment that we're seeing constantly with people getting money or actually being better off because they took advantage, because they had the privileges and connections to take advantage of a program and then push other people to the back of the line, or so that they don't get help at all, which is what we're seeing with, I fear, hundreds of thousands of small businesses that will unnecessarily close permanently for no other reason that we did not have a strong enough government institutions to make sure they got the relief they needed. The next, Ellie Price asks, what policies could nudge corporations to pay workers who are paid around or below median income slightly more? Well, look, I believe very much in pushing companies to do the right thing, but the best way to push companies to do the right thing is to have policies that ensure that they do. And, I can't tell you how many times you hear from companies, I'd love to pay my workers a living wage, but my competitors don't. I'll get run out of business. I'd love to do the right thing, but it's too hard for me. I had an article in the Atlantic. I hope some of you will read. It's an excerpt. It's called "Punching Stephen Curry," and it's really just a metaphor that talks about that. People think of like more regulation or less regulation, but the truth is it's how we structure markets. Do we structure markets so people compete in ways that are vigorous and hard competition, but they're in ways that lift us as a people, or do people compete in a race to the bottom? And right now what happens is we see continually in our economy that people compete by how little they can pay workers. And to give you an example of a trend that's happening I've seen it in my lifetime, and you see it everywhere now, which is that companies, governments, your university probably has people who work for you, but they don't really work for you. They're not really your employee. They're a contractor. Why are they a contractor? It didn't used to be that way. They're full-time people who clean and serve food. Why is that happening? It was a way for companies and universities and governments to do better fiscally by giving people less economic security. And not only that, it gives people less dignity. It doesn't make them first-class citizens. When people are contracted out, they often aren't invited to the birthday parties, to take your daughter to school, to work type of things, the networking. And I find it outrageous, and I don't think it's something we should accept. We should not accept processes that allow second-class citizenship at work. So if you had either universal health care that wasn't maybe tied to employers, or maybe we said that that you can't discriminate in your wages or benefits between the people who are full-time employees and the people who are contractors, well, then maybe we would encourage more companies to bring those workers back in the fold. This is not a little deal. Larry Katz projects 30% of income inequality in the last few decades has been for this type of thing. So I want to encourage companies to do the right thing, but the best way to do it is to have the fight for 15, is to have a living wage, is to have universal paid sick leave. Then we all know all of the companies have to do it. And when you give that worker $15 an hour, well, guess what? It's going to bump up the people who are now getting $15 an hour, and they're now going to get closer to the median wage. And you could also do things like expand the earned income tax credit so it goes up higher to 50, 60, 70,000, or give more childcare help. These things together, you may not call them technically wages, but what you want to care about is, does a family with their wage and with our policies together have the capacity to support their family with economic dignity? Javier Fernandez Lopez is a public policy student at Harris, graduating this year. He asks, and Emily, I'm assuming you want me just to repeat these as opposed to them coming on to say them themselves. Is that correct? I will assume so. He asked, is there any smart approach, technically efficacious and politically feasible, to force the big economic companies to provide their workers with a minimum of economic security? You know, I think I just went through some of those things. I think out here in California, there's been a real debate on, you know, with Uber and others about who is considered a full-time employee. So right now, a lot of that fight is about classification. And I think that if you're someone who's fighting for economic dignity and you care about these issues, you want as many workers to be classified as full-time employees instead of contractors, because then that comes with it a series of more eligibility. But I want to say, and I say this in the book, our long-term goal should be to perhaps not just have a fight on worker classification, but to build a safety net that says, however you work, you should be covered. We're making a little bit of a positive step with the gig workers being covered in the unemployment insurance. So I think we either have to decide, remember, the goal of economic dignity is to focus on the end goal, the goal of people. And it makes you realize there might be different ways to get there, but you got to get there one way or the other. So one way is you put more obligation on the employer to cover all these things. And that is one obligation. And when you do that, then you really fight for classification more as full-time employees. The other way to do it is to have the government providing more of these things, having sick leave, other things, not necessarily coming just from the employer. But so I think that it is a combination of either strengthening what employers are required to do, not allowing them to discriminate between contractors and full-time employees, or starting to have the type of government policies, as you see people who support Medicare for all support, where that degree of economic security comes more from us policy-wise as a country collectively. And people often, again, say, oh, I'm for this way or that way. Well, I'm for the end goal of people having economic dignity, having economic security, having universal health care. There might be different ways to get there, but you got to get there. And I think that has to be the focus. Next question is on video. Shannon Bradford, I hear I'm going to get to see you to ask a question. I'm so excited.
Hi there. Thanks so much for being here. My question comes from a paper that I recently read for my development economics class. I'm a graduate student at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. And I was asked to share where I am this quarter. I'm in Chicago. I wanted to ask if you are familiar with Dr. Paul Collier's paper on, or actually I think it was within a book that he published in the past couple of years, where he proposed taxing the gains of agglomeration as rents, so taxing high-skilled workers. And if you are familiar with that, would just love to hear your thoughts on if that could provide economic dignity in the long run.
So, of course, I know Paul Collier. I'm not as familiar with that proposal. But look, I think that the first thing you have to do to try to fund, to have the resources for this kind of larger economic dignity compact, which is inherently affordable for us as a country, is you have to find a way of having more progressivity. I mean, I think people might be willing to chip in a little more for some of their economic security. People pay a little more in California on their payroll to have paid leave. So people can be willing to contribute a little if they think it's going to promote their economic security and economic dignity. But it's hard to ask people to do anything right now because they see the amazing disparities in wealth. And, you know, one of the new ideas that I really support is this idea of a small wealth tax on excessive wealth. And think about why. You know, people say, well, you know, I mean, income, of course, is the way we do it. And I think we have to have a very progressive tax code that asks people who are doing better annually every year to pay a little more to contribute. But, you know, if you want to look at if you want to judge well-being, if somebody is worth 50 million or more, which was all Elizabeth Warren's proposal went after, it didn't touch you at all if you didn't have 50 million. Well, you know you're well off. I mean, somebody gave an example once about, well, you know, the difference between being an offensive lineman in the NFL who might make, you know, some money for 2 years. They get taxed high, but they never make money again, where then Tom Brady makes, you know, is worth $100 million. So wealth inequality is a scandal in our country. It's obscene, and we have clearly failed to tax it. And I do believe that the type of proposal Elizabeth Warren had, where you took a little of that and put that into having, she may have not used the phrase economic dignity, but more of a caring economy where people had universal care. You know, for me, I think that would be one of my first priorities. I think that conservatives have politicized the estate tax so much. They call it a death tax. They make people think it's going to happen to average people. Well, nobody's confused about the wealth tax. They get that it only hits you if you have wealth over a certain amount. So I think our first step to me would be to do that. The only thing I would say is let's not just focus on taxing the people of excessive wealth to use for good reasons. Let's also help more families have some wealth themselves. And you know, one of the sad legacies of our country is the amount of racial discrimination and redlining that has hurt so many African American and minority families, and it's hurt home ownership, and that takes away that wealth and that cushion that can mean so much to a family, particularly during a hard time. So I think where I would start right now is let's do a little better job of taxing excessive wealth and using that to fund more of this kind of economic dignity agenda. All right, who do I have next? The next is Brianna. Is there a Brianna Payton?
Yes.
Brianna.
Hi.
Great
so
to see
you
you.
already heard from me. It's a part 2. I'm at, like you mentioned before, I'm at SSA finishing my master's, and I'm currently taking the quarter from home in Michigan with my family. I just wanted
Where
to
in
ask,
Michigan?
Farmington Hills.
I'm from Ann Arbor.
Okay,
home.
cool. My mom went to University of Michigan, so that's like, you know, fun times. But I just wanted to add some specificity to kind of the question that I asked about government assistance post-COVID, because something that's really struck me is the way that aid has been dispensed so much more kind of liberally, or without as many restrictions, or without as many questions, means testing, drug testing, in general, just policing of the people that are receiving it during COVID, which on one hand I understand because we're in a national crisis, but on the other hand, I feel like people face corona level crises in their lives all the time, and often have a much harder time getting aid, or there's way more restrictions on it. And so I guess I was just wondering if you had thoughts on any of the ways that we're dispensing aid to the American public right now gives us lessons that we could apply to the way that we provide government assistance to people that are on welfare or need food stamps or different assistance like that in the post-COVID era.
Well, look, I mean, I think one of the sad things in our country, and it's been a battle for decades, is that there is a degree of meanness in our system of aids, and it just hurts me to the core. You know, you take something, you know, when it's people in need, we have the greatest degree of scrutiny. And these policies are put to be at times, I think, punitive. And the impression is that somebody getting SNAP or food, like, oh my God, they might be cheating, they might not deserve it, when there's just no evidence of that. Social Security disability is a lifeline. The average person on Social Security disability worked 22 years. They're a hard worker. Most of them work through their disability to the end. And then people find, oh, I saw a person here or there who might have not really deserved it. And then they punish the 95% of people who desperately need that money. And of course, what drives you crazy is there's none of that scrutiny to people who are putting money in offshore offshore wealth. So, I mean, first of all, there's just a terrible inequity. And so I don't know that that's a lesson we needed from this crisis. I think that those of us who believe in progressive government have to have policies that get away from that kind of punitive, they say work requirements, when almost everybody in our country wants to work and contribute. And if they're not, it's because they really haven't gotten the help they need. That's why I talk in the book about a compassionate compact of contribution. I'm not for just like saying everybody gets this amount of money no matter what you're doing, but this kind of punitive measure is terrible. And a compassionate compact says, I think everybody is trying to contribute. I think there's people with disabilities who would like to contribute as much as they can. There's people coming back from addiction. There's people who are caring for 3 children and their economics impact. And so instead of saying, oh, they're freeloaders, let's try to help them contribute, live with dignity and support. Now, I do want to say one thing about kind of government though, which is it's considered really boring to focus on unemployment administration. But when we get to a crisis, the weakness in our government structures prevents us from having great solutions. After the financial crisis, you were relying on the servicing sector in real estates to help modify mortgages, and they were a disaster. But we should be building government up so that they can help do that. And we come to a pandemic like this, and people can't, and we pass a smart unemployment insurance, and we don't get the money to the people when they need it. So smart government where we use more technology, where we have, I don't believe that there is or needs to be stigma in government. You can be giving people money directly through cards, through the EITC. The Affordable Care Act's a beautiful story of everybody gets on the same website and goes to the same process. So I think that a lot of the reality is you do have to work on the nuts and bolts about how you deliver to people, deliver well, deliver efficiently, deliver effectively. And hopefully the more we do that, the more we can fight off the people who want to use government delivery as kind of an ideological, social Darwinistic, mean-spirited, punitive way of, I think, often discriminating against people who they think are the other or not doing their share.
Yeah, I really appreciate that response. And hopefully now that we've all been hit by a crisis, we can have a little more compassion for people that deal with these types of instabilities every day.
Absolutely. And when you look at something like paid sick leave, we should do that morally. It's the right thing to do. But now it may be occurring to people that, hey, when people don't have health care or when they have to go back to work when they're sick, not only is that wrong morally, that's not good for everybody because it's going to hurt everybody's public health. And, I'd like to think people would just like to do it because it's the right thing, but maybe people are also seeing it's the smart thing as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Andrew Erickson. I'm supposed to see you on video. I see your name. There you are.
Awesome. Right here, Gene. Thanks. I'm a first year at Booth with Booth's Government and Policy Club. I have been staying here in Chicago for the duration of everything. So that's been great. I think, in many ways, your idea around economic dignity, which is one I definitely subscribe to, aligns more closely with sort of the more progressive, wing of the Democratic caucus, and sort of espouses the values that Bernie and Elizabeth Warren had. Do you think that their struggle to sort of expand their base from 2016 and secure the nomination is going to be a setback for kind of expanding this view of economic dignity? And then also, what do you think it's going to take to get more people to subscribe to it?
I believe the most important thing is really how you move the whole country. Right now you have a lot of these people who are extremely progressive in the House of Representatives, but they can't even pass a lot of the bills there. That's not their fault. But you've had other people who I think would have loved to govern more progressively. But, look at Bill Clinton. He had all Republican House and Senate for 6 years. It limits the degree of ambition. But I still think you can move forward. So even in the Clinton era, where you did face a more conservative country, he went out with a value statement, which was, if you work full time, you shouldn't have to raise your kids in poverty, and use that to get a major expansion of the EITC and support that. And now a family making $17,000 gets $7,000 more. Now that didn't happen in one swoop, but he kind of won that argument that tax credits for children and for work could be refundable. And Pelosi and some others took the torch, and Obama took the torch. And I love the fact that Clinton to Bernie Sanders all use that line: if you work full time, you shouldn't have to raise your family with dignity. So I think that it is a lot about winning these arguments. And I think that I think, first of all, there's been a little change in our dialogue, which I understand and I've lived through. I think I came at a time when Democrats had been in the wilderness so long, and there was just so much pressure to show you could get stuff done, that you weren't over-promising. And when I look at people like AOC, who I find so inspiring, I feel a little like they're saying, okay, we understand what your generation had to do, but we need to have that bigger vision, even if we can't get it done like that. Because whether you call it moving the Overton window, or you're shifting the center. And I do believe that both, not just the Democratic Party, but I think there's many ways that the country is starting to shift against the excess corporate power, against excess economic concentration. And I think part of the message we have here is also communicating that we're not just winning, a move to the left or progressivity, but we're reclaiming American ideals. I quote in my book Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, when he's talking about a living wage. If I read it to you, you'd think, well, that was Bernie Sanders speaking. But that notion that if you're doing your part, you're contributing, you're trying to pull your share of the load, that is what FDR used to get the first New Deal. And I think that, when I hear people, I think that is a way that we can use this crisis to say, no, it's not just about the shift. It's that it goes to our other conversation, that America is about the fact that people should that we should have a compact, that there's no reason that we can't say that all of us should have a degree of economic security and dignity in our lives. So I think part of it is you are shifting towards more progressive things, but you ultimately get it done because you're moving the country with you, or you're claiming that these values, that you are a better representative of some of these idealized values that we haven't realized.
Great, thanks.
Mustafa, not on video. Ibrahim, what are your views on modern monetary theory, and how does that influence the policies you recommend to address the crisis of economic dignity? Well, look, first of all, Professor Shelton, I have a lot of respect for and admire. I don't know that I agree with all of that, but I think but this really is an important issue. related to having the right end goal. I have found a lot over the last 20, 30 years that people were like either for deficit reduction or against deficit reduction, for fiscal discipline or against it. That to me is a great example of misinterpreting means and ends. If you're for something, it should be cut like that. It's a policy. You're not for it as if it's an end goal in itself. It's important if you can argue that it is a means to improving the lives of all people, or in my view, ensuring universal economic dignity. I still feel that there was a period in our country in the early 90s where there was an overwhelming concern where a Democrat showing that they could govern responsibly and bring down deficits that Reagan and Bush had led to really did have an impact on long-term interest rates. It really did have an impact on investment. And I think it probably did help lead to one of the few times we had shared economic growth over the last 50 years. Now that leads some people to say, well, I'm for that. Well, my view was, well, that seemed to be at that time with those economics, there was a decent case for it. That case is much less strong right now. Right now, there's just so little evidence that the United States government borrowing crowds out private investment, raises interest rates. You know, John Maynard Keynes has this view, the saying, have you changed your mind? He says, well, the facts have changed. What would you recommend I do? So to me, you need to look at all times. And I'm not saying that the fact that it doesn't matter now means that it won't matter 15 or 20 years from now. But right now, the case is not strong. And 2 points that I have to say that are very important. One is the hypocrisy is just overwhelming. I mean, the hypocrisy of Republicans, be political here, but it's just true. The hypocrisy of Republicans only caring about deficits when there's a Democratic president trying to help working and poor people, and then turn around and do a $2 trillion deficit increasing tax cut that goes mostly to large corporations. Let me tell you something. Lowering the corporate rate from 35 to 21%, that was just outrageous. I don't even remember a CEO asking that they wanted the rate lowered that low. So this idea that, that the hypocrisy is very stunning. And I kind of share the view that, that we're not going to be whiplashed like this. But secondly, you're not seeing as much economic argument of worrying about that. And third, most relevant, there is almost no case for not doing everything you can right now. Because think about it, even if you had a more fiscal discipline focus, right now you have incredibly low interest rates. This is what Jerome Powell is saying. And you have a chance to do one-time huge amount of borrowing to make sure states stay afloat, that families stay afloat, that small businesses stay afloat. So that one-time borrowing, when you have such low interest rates and no evidence of a crowd out effect, is almost certain not to have a long-term negative view. But yet on the other hand, if you allow this terrible crisis we're going through to go from a jobs recession to a jobs depression or a few years of double-digit unemployment, what do you think that's going to do to the deficit anyways? It's going to make it worse. It's counterproductive. So I think that right now, I think the idea that you've seen from Bernie to Elizabeth to Biden of generally feeling you should figure out a way that when you're doing something permanent, that you try to find progressive taxes or something to pay for it is largely right. I think there's a good case that there's things like investing in young children or green infrastructure where you could argue it will pay back in time. But right now in this crisis, I don't even understand what the argument is against doing everything necessary that's both compassionate and economically smart to help us get through this once in 102-year pandemic. All right. The next question is from Yu Wei Wang, is graduating Harris MPP, and asks, what policies could better help workers to secure economic dignity when facing challenges brought by AI? Transit more frequently between jobs, industries. Couple of points. And, they're points I make in the book, which is one, it's always a mistake in economics to necessarily believe you can stop every trend, but it's also a mistake to think that you can't help shape trends. We could be doing more as a country to be asking how AI could be shaped to help enrich jobs or create new jobs. Yes, you can't prevent the fact that technology and automation will often make certain work less efficient. That's been happening since the beginning of time, but it also means that you can't invest in a country. Like we couldn't have an AI ARPA that asks, what can we do that is both that is AI related that could create more jobs, and we could be more creative. For example, if we decide we need less bus drivers, does that mean we have to lay off the bus drivers? I don't think so, because on school buses, there's bullying, because older people and people with disabilities have trouble. What if we said, instead of laying off those jobs, if we had someone driving it, that person could be trained and given a career in helping young children and helping kids who are isolated or being bullied, or helping older people or people with disabilities. And that goes to my second point. Do not buy the idea that there will be less jobs in our economy. Yes, there could be less jobs in particular areas, but what I want to say is that when you look at what kind of society you want, we have a huge job deficit. We are a horrible country when it comes to helping out families who have somebody with a disability or autism or any challenge. It's like they're on their own and they're heroic. David Axelrod is one of those heroic parents. And we praise them, but it's a little bit like when we praise the essential workers and don't help them. I'll tell you the type of jobs that we could have, and I call them double dignity jobs, because they're jobs that you could make, value jobs. They could be higher skilled, they could allow people career paths and higher pay, but they're in the service of giving dignified lives to others. Think about the people leaving prison. If we had skilled professionals helping them transition, if we had more skilled people working in lower income schools to help with individualized attention, college advising, if we had more people helping those heroic parents who want their children not just to survive, but to thrive and do well, even if they have some form of disability. Those would be amazing jobs for people, meaningful service jobs in the way Martin Luther King meant, and they would provide greater dignity to others. So if we have less jobs needed in the private sector due to automation and robots, but we have more wealth, I say, let's take that wealth and create an army of double dignity jobs that give people the pride of working and contributing to their fellow neighbor, and giving more dignity to people that we tell too much right now in our economy, you're on your own. Final question is from John McDonough, which is fair since he opened up the introduction. So John, you want to come back on video, and maybe John felt like he didn't mention some negative things about me. He's going to come back a little, even the score, but the floor is yours.
Not at all. But I just want to say thank you again for coming to speak with us today. So I guess for the final question, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the potential political and legal challenges for implementing your vision of economic dignity and how to overcome them. I mean, you mentioned Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, which sparked some debate when she introduced it, even among more progressive legal scholars, about potential constitutionality considerations. And as we've seen with the Affordable Care Act, defending policy from lawsuits is critical for long-term viability. So how do you think about these obstacles when you're thinking about sort of implementing economic dignity?
Well, look, there's no doubt, people always kind of say to me, well, you were in government and you didn't do this or that. And look, you are constrained by the political reality you face. But I think that you try to do the best you can when you're in government. But I think that the really positive message from so many of the progressives has been keep that bigger vision so that you're always moving forward. You're always letting people know what that vision is. And then second, look where those moments are that where you really can appeal, where you can win the majority of the country. So just a couple lessons. I mean, I feel like the fight for 15 is truly one of the most inspirational things I've seen in my lifetime. And I'll tell you why, because when you're in the White House, the minimum wage is $7.25. You had zero chance of increasing it significantly. So that can lead you to say, well, there's just nothing you can do, political reality. Or you could say, of course, you'll never be able to get structural labor, reform and more unionization and collective bargaining with a Republican Congress. What I loved about the Fight for 15 is they just said, great, we'll take it to the rest of the country. They started pushing for sectoral bargaining. They started, passing minimum wage at state and city levels. People like Ai-jen Poo and the National Domestic Workers said, well, we might not be able to traditionally organize, but maybe we can pass state legislation that creates a board where our voices will be represented. And I think it's just a beautiful case, and it's a lesson to me too, which is that even if you're stuck in Washington, you can start winning that debate and moving the country your way. So now, Fight for 15, that doesn't seem that radical. 30% of the country is on the way to a $15 minimum wage. And I think that again, I said this before, I think there's places where it's somewhat moving people to a more progressive approach, but also I think sometimes it's just appealing to people's sense of right and wrong now. And so, for example, when you mentioned the Elizabeth Warren agenda, I think that most Americans do not at all buy a shareholder maximization view. I think you poll and ask people, do you think the main goal of companies is their workers and communities or their shareholders? They'll say workers and communities. I mean, that's something, workers on the board, more worker representation, not being retaliated against. I think that's something where we have the public, we've got to do a better chance of not letting our views be demagogued and getting out there, because I think the public believes companies should be there, whether they say economic dignity or not, but to serve our people. And I think there we got to translate that, and I think we have the public with us. We've got to do a better job of finding a way to overcome the special interests, overcoming the demagoguery, overcoming Fox News, because I think the public's already with us on there. And I think the minimum wage as well has always been something that independent voters were for, even very conservative voters, because they realize, hey, if you're out there doing your share, shouldn't you have a living wage? Living wages have been supported by Adam Smith and Teddy Roosevelt. It's not just, a progressive, shift. It's out there, and I think we just have to win the argument better, because I think the values of the American public are with us.
Great, thank you.
So I think that there's a red hook coming out somewhere to pull me off. Thank you all so much for having me. It's really an honor. It really is an honor for me to have a chance to talk to you and talk about my book. So appreciate it.